I started Heart Keenwah with this idea of using a brand to make quinoa part of people's everyday. It came from my own personal conviction. I'm really obsessed with quinoa. Like, I eat this stuff every day. I discovered it on my own personal journey becoming a vegetarian. And there's a whole host of reasons why quinoa should be the food of the future. It's sustainable, protein, plant-based. And I wanted to build a company that would help propel quinoa's adoption rate and also have a sustainability story. You know, we source from smallholder farmers. We go to Bolivia every year. And so this all made perfect sense as sort of a mission in my head. But of course, taking that in terms of translating to product is a little harder, right? We actually found ourselves embarked on a very ambitious path. It's like, how do you change culture, right? I wasn't asking for people to just try quinoa. I wanted them to eat it every day. And so that requires you to really change people's eating habits and their perception and their level of education towards quinoa. And the first, I guess, go-to-market part of that is really the format. But like most entrepreneurs who are sort of intoxicated by their own naivete and enthusiasm, you kind of just wing it, right? And so we did. We launched with our first product, which is still out there, so I'm not bashing it, but you can kind of see the foreshadowing here, what happened to the first product. It was a quinoa cluster. It was it was like a granola, but it was cut in a square. It wasn't a cereal, it was a snack. It was not in a bar, it was thrown into a stand-up gusset bag. It was made with quinoa seeds, quinoa crisps, quinoa puffs, hemp seeds, chia seeds, cacao nibs, like name the superfood, we threw it in there, right? And it had a lot going on, it was very busy. But we got some pretty interesting traction in the early days. We launched at small markets, we got some national distribution very early on. We got caught up in this whole ancient grain craze. Quinoa became suddenly Gwyneth Paltrow's top eat, and Dr. Oz was talking about it, and all that was like very serendipitous for us. And we raised money on the momentum, and that's where it started to get a little dicey, right? After we closed our round, we used a lot of that money to help fund our expansion into, I guess, more conventional retail, and we sort of saw some signs. What translated decently well in health food and Whole Foods type stores and demoed well didn't necessarily have the same sort of appeal or translation in conventional. And we started to kind of view this item as being a little bit ceiling bound in terms of velocity. And so we also saw ourselves faced with a whole host of new competition in this sort of new wave of snacks, right? In 2013, 2014, it wasn't just quinoa clusters, but you also had the emergence of kale chips and coconut chips and cricket bars and all these new, weird, interesting snacks that people wanted to try. So we weren't the only interesting snack in town. And so we had to kind of make a strategic decision, either kind of coast by and hope that our problems would work themselves out, or sort of be honest with ourselves, recognize some of the early signs we were seeing in terms of velocity, and take a step back, which would, of course, require us to go back to our investors with our tail between our legs and say, you know, we may need to rethink this. We ended up doing the latter, and I think it taught us a lesson, right? We really put the pause button, and we came back to our core mission, right? When I started this company, it was never necessarily to be a quinoa cluster brand, right? It went back to this lofty goal of making quinoa part of people's everyday. The problem is that people don't eat it every day. I'm going to solve that problem through interesting formats and a brand with a voice and a sustainability story. And there are multiple ways, right, to connect the problem and the solution. And I think our challenge as entrepreneurs is to sort of be open to that reality that maybe the first path that you embarked on, and maybe that first format, isn't necessarily the end-all be-all, and there may be another path. So I guess my lesson is that you be open to that. In our case, I mean, we did end up doing better with our subsequent products. We pivoted into more, I guess, mass-friendly formats. We did a cheese puff made of quinoa. We did chocolate-covered puff made of quinoa. We did cereal. We did grain. We really pivoted into a platform brand, which has served our brand well. It's not necessarily the path for everyone, but it just goes to show that we weren't necessarily afraid or too stubborn to admit that maybe there was flaws in our first product. I guess the other small detail is on consumer packaged goods. I find that simpler is better. So this may not work for everyone, but particularly if you have like an exotic ingredient or there's something that's really superlatively strange and interesting about your product, keep everything else kind of more normcore. So we found that with the puffs, right, it's basically a Cheeto with quinoa. So I've only really changed one thing, and that had much more impact with the mainstream consumer than the quinoa clusters, which are like, oh, it's a granola cut into a square, it tastes like a brittle, it's got hemp and cheese. You know, you lose people on that when you try to be too much. So simple is better. That's my story.